So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Lachlan Hoy. So Lachlan runs two very successful specialty contact lens practices in Adelaide. He holds a couple of professional fellowships. He's a past president of the CCLSA, the author of a textbook chapter on keratoconus, and a director and founder of three eye care companies. So he's the director of Innovative Contact Lenses, which makes amazing specialty contact lenses, which is with a lot of focus on orthokeratology and clear lenses. So I first met Lachlan 11 years ago as fresh grads in Shanghai, and at the time I thought, oh my god, this is probably one of the smartest guys I've met. 11 years later, I still think the same thing. So Lachlan, as well as running two very successful practices, seeing patients, running his and designing contact lenses, he's also a dad and also a good friend. So please join with me in welcoming Lachlan.
Wow, well that was a very lovely introduction, Jess. So, demystifying the Ortho lens. Jess asked me to come along and speak to you guys about Ortho K lenses, and something that I speak about fairly regularly, and this particular talk is a new one, so I'm not sure where it's going to go. We'll see what happens. Out of interest, how many people here are fitting Ortho K lenses? Good. So yeah, a reasonable majority of the room. So first and foremost, I'm an optometrist. I run a practice called Innovative Eye Care in Adelaide. It's where I live 3 days a week. We've got two practices, one in Hutt Street in the CBD, another one out at Woodville. We've got a team of 5 optometrists who work with me each and every day, and we do a whole series of different things. Yes, we prescribe spectacles, but we do a lot of bespoke contact lenses, Ortho K, keratoconus, which is probably my real passion. We do a lot of myopia control, kids, dry eyes, we've got all the toys under the sun, and in particular, both my practices are in medical centres. So we do a lot of red eye management as well. Eye space, I like to think was born out of pizza and beer on Friday nights. Lucky enough tonight to have Jake Brown with us. Jake is actually a childhood friend of mine. We both grew up in the Barossa Valley, drinking and making a lot of this stuff. And Jake can talk to you about that. But Jake is a physicist and computer science engineer. And between the two of us, since 2010, this has been a little project of ours, which is to try and make fitting rigid contact lenses and specialty contact lenses easier. That's really the motivation behind what we're doing. And where it all started for me was actually fitting these sorts of eyes. It was managing keratoconus in that I was already using a Medmont topographer, and I'd written my own Excel programs to calculate the sagittal heights and curvatures of all sorts of different lenses. And essentially I approached Jake to help me build a software program that could simulate asymmetrical lenses, which at the time was fairly challenging. And through all of that, what we discovered is while we could do things like this, where in fact with a keratoconic eye we could simulate the lens, which you can see the computer simulation there on the left. We could put these lenses on eye, and we've discovered that really the similarity between the computer simulation and what actually happened on eye was remarkably similar, even for very complicated lenses. What we actually discovered is what was a hell of a lot easier to do was actually to design Ortho K lenses with this program. So Ortho K immediately became one of the very simple things that I went from fitting designs like CRT, GOV, etc., to actually designing my own lenses. And that's what we're going to start talking about today. So Ortho K, the definition, I think it's somewhat confusing and sometimes poorly understood either by optometrists or our colleagues in ophthalmology as to what actually Ortho K is. Well, in 1976, they talked about Ortho K being about the reduction, modification, elimination of refractive error by the programmed application of contact lenses. John Malford, in his first textbook, described Ortho-K as the reduction of refractive error which doesn't compromise best corrected visual acuity. However, where Ortho-K has evolved to, we still don't actually have a set definition, so I thought I'd have a crack at it. So, to understand what we're doing and as optometrists what we need to do with these is it's important to understand that I actually think this is a procedure. It's not simply just fitting a contact lens, it is a procedure where contact lenses worn while sleeping reshape the cornea, and on removal of that contact lens we get improved daytime vision and unaided vision in particular through the minimisation of refractive error. We simply cannot eliminate all refractive error, but we can certainly minimise it, and the key thing here is unaided vision. So as we break this down into this definition and we start talking about Ortho-K, it becomes about the lens, the key to it, sleeping. Funnily enough, I actually wear an Ortho-K lens. I happen to be Plano +2, and I typically wear an Ortho-K lens in my left eye. While preparing this talk, I didn't sleep very much last night and forgot to put it in and turned up this morning not being able to see, and I had to in fact go and see Jess this morning and steal a Total Dailies 1 from Alcon and put that in my left eye so I could see today. Otherwise, being a one-eyed person, I walk around in circles. So we have a lens, needs to be worn while we sleep. We need to understand the shape of the cornea, and corneal topography is key to that. And one of the things I don't see a lot of optometrists who do Ortho-K do enough is actually measure unaided vision. And then we start talking about refractive error. And refractive error is far more when we think about Ortho-K than sphere, sill and axis. So often I have students with me and I actually ask them, do you understand what optometry actually is? And optometry, if we go back to the definition, we are sight measurers. And as sight measurers, some key things, especially when we think about Ortho-K lenses, is the measurement of unaided vision. And I would highly encourage you to, when you start thinking about a patient, not think about them as someone who's -1, -2, -3. Start thinking about what their unaided vision is naturally. And if we start thinking about Ortho-K, we want to improve that unaided vision. So it's something that you should measure at baseline, and you should measure it at each and every appointment. And you should do it monocularly. Retinoscopy. Now, retinoscopy with Ortho-K is, in my opinion, just as important as doing topography. If you get very good at doing retinoscopy, you'll see things that you've never seen before. We talk about seeing scissoring reflexes with keratoconus, but with Ortho-K in particular, I've tried to give you a diagram of what I tend to see, which is where you'll see the central reflex go with, whereas the peripheral reflex in fact goes against. As we actually create a centered distance near periphery multifocal, and we induce a hell of a lot of spherical aberration, and in particular negative spherical aberration when we do Ortho-K. We can talk about refraction. However, I actually pretty much never do a refraction at an aftercare for an Ortho-K patient, because my unaided vision, my retinoscope, and my corneal topography tells me what I've done. And when we have so much spherical aberration, a normal subjective refraction is somewhat meaningless. And the final one is this higher order aberration. And unless you're lucky enough to have a wavefront aberrometer, your best way of thinking about higher order aberration is firstly your retinoscope, and secondly is listening to your patients. Get them to describe what they see. Show them a point source and get them to describe either the comet tails or the halos, and those sorts of things that are created when you actually induce these higher order aberrations, especially with someone with large pupils. This is not a typical result with Ortho-K, but it does certainly demonstrate my point. If you can look at this and you understand what you're looking at a refractive power map. In the top left-hand corner, you have the baseline refractive power map. In the bottom left-hand corner, you have the post-Ortho-K map, and the one on the right that's the larger map is in fact the difference between the two. So this shows you the refractive change you've made to the anterior surface of the cornea and ultimately how you've changed their refractive error. What you'll see is you've got dark blue in the center and you've got a little figure 8. Now the green in fact means no change. Blue is where you've actually corrected myopia, and the yellow, orange and reds is where you've actually induced hyperopia. Now, or corrected hyperopia, in fact induced the opposite, myopia. Now in this case, if you look in the very bottom left-hand corner and bottom right-hand corner, if you've got extremely good vision, you'll see that shows there's actually in fact minus 7.8 diopters of change here. Well, you'll see over the size of that pupil, we go from 7.8 diopters all the way to the green, which is at the very edge of the pupil. That is 7.8 diopters of spherical aberration over the pupil zone. Is it enormous? Okay, enormous. But it is also what helps us control myopia. It is what makes it every single Ortho-K talk that I ever do, I describe all Ortho-K is multifocal. So Ortho-K is wonderful for myopia control for the reasons I'm going to discuss in a moment. It's also a fantastic modality for presbyopes because this is a centered distance near periphery multifocal. So if you all know what spherical aberration, which as optometrists I'm sure you all do, and you've probably seen this before, this is in fact negative spherical aberration. This is what Ortho-K creates in all myopes. In all myopes it creates negative spherical aberration. Now, if you believe the work by Professor Lewis Smith at Houston University, he's did this work nearly a decade ago with the monkey lab. He talked about peripheral retina, and the peripheral retina being where the signals for eye growth are and induced myopia. And he described it with this sort of diagram where if we wear spectacles, yes, and we put a minus powered lens in front of a myope's eye, we can correct the focus to the central retina. However, the peripheral retina ends up relatively hyperopic. Someone described then that in actual fact in Ortho-K, because we create the central retina has more minus correction and the peripheral cornea is relatively myopic on the other hand, we can shift that profile. However, there's a hell of a lot of assumptions there, and as it all get you to understand is it's really just a matter of geometry, and surely not does all of the light that goes through the to the peripheral retina all have to go through the peripheral cornea. It simply doesn't work that way. And plenty of papers afterwards have somewhat debunked that, which I would completely agree with. And an enormous study, which often doesn't get talked about, which was published 4 years ago by Dave Atchison and co., where they looked at the peripheral refraction data on nearly 2,000 7-year-olds and 1,000 14-year-olds, showed that in fact when you actually look at peripheral retina, it isn't an indicator for the progression of myopia. Whereas actually a really great study out of the guys at QUT have looked at eyes with higher order aberrations. And they've shown that the eyes that have more higher order aberrations in fact have more rapid eye growth. Sorry, pardon me, the other way around. The eyes with less higher order aberration have more rapid eye growth, whereas the eyes with more high order aberration, like we induce with Ortho-K lenses, actually don't tend to grow as fast. So why are aberrations important to remember? Well, Ortho-K lenses do tend to induce a lot of higher order aberrations, and in particular, they tend to induce coma. Spherical aberration if they're well centered, but the moment these lenses are not centered over the visual axis, they tend to induce a lot of coma. Horizontal for horizontally displaced lenses and vertical for vertically displaced lenses, and your patients will describe this to you as comet tails, flare when they look at light sources. The easiest way of showing patients how this changes is to turn your room down to very dim light, get them to look at a light source, get them to look at it, cover one eye, and then get the brightest pen torch you have and shine it in front of the other eye, and watch their pupil go small and then go, wow, what did you do? It's all clear. Something that's very easy to demonstrate to patients. Now, plenty of studies have shown this. We know that contrast sensitivity reduces the moment you induce higher order aberrations. However, decentration doesn't tend to affect the spherical power when we do a subjective refraction for myopia correction. So why don't Ortho K lenses center? Well, this is the most common reason why. And pretty much all Ortho K lenses don't center over the visual axis, nor do they center over the pupil center. Nearly none. Why? Because our eyes are not perfect optical systems. And we have optical eccentricity, where the corneal center is not the center of the pupil, nor is it the center of the visual axis. When we all do pupillometry, we've all looked through measured PDs in all our spectacle patients. Do we measure to the center of the pupil, or do we go to the corneal light reflex? We go to the corneal light reflex because we know that's where the visual axis is. We know that's not in the center of the pupil, but it is where we need to center our optics, which, if you have a Placido topographer, the position is of the visual axis is absolutely smack bang in the middle of those rings. That's where, if they align their eye and they align their fixation to the center of that little ring and they're looking right at it, that's where their visual axis is. Whereas the cornea, center of the cornea is denoted by the two blue lines, and the center of the pupil is slightly above it. So you'll see we have different reference centers, okay? And ultimately this will mean that the optics rarely either for Ortho K lenses and in particularly for soft lenses, because soft lenses all decenter slightly temporal and slightly inferior. All soft lenses do. If you look at them and you look at how they overlap the limbus, they all go slightly temporal and slightly inferior, which guess where the visual axis is? Slightly nasal and slightly inferior. So when you start fitting multifocal soft lenses, one of the reasons our industry's had such trouble with these is because nearly none of them center over the visual axis. And when we start talking about things like angle lambda, angle alpha, all those sorts of things, the same things and the same reason why, for instance, cataract surgeons who implant multifocal intraocular lenses with the haptic will center based upon limbus to limbus, okay? Which is basically where the cornea is, which is basically where Ortho K lenses center. And they all tend to center slightly superior and slightly temporal of center. However, outside of that, what other reasons do we have for decentration and what can we control? Because the reality is you can't control this, okay? What can you control? Well, we know the main reason why lenses decenter is they're either too small. Small lenses have multiple different positions within a cornea that they can sit. They're either too shallow. If you don't have central clearance, or if you've got minimal peripheral lens bearing, you'll get an unstable lens. If we have a lens that sits here and we've got the periphery of the lens makes it stable, that's great. The moment we have central touch, the lens is unstable. So steep, you want to make lenses deeper. And the other reason is an asymmetrical cornea. Think about things like keratoconus. If our cornea is inferiorly steep, it's inherently tilted, and the lens itself will decenter inferiorly, especially in form fruste or frank keratoconus, like the case on the right-hand side. So the next thing we really need to understand when we're doing the procedure of orthokeratology is we need to understand, as kera sounds, we need to understand the cornea and the corneal shape. So the evolution of corneal topography has been enormous. As Jess pointed out, we met each other 11 years ago. In fact, next week is 12 years I've been in practice. And over that time, we can basically go from the third one along all the way to the last one, and pretty much nearly the 100 years before that, you've got those first two being our keratometers. And we know with the keratometer, it's really only measuring a very small region of the cornea, 2 points. It's not the central cornea, it's actually at about 3 or 4 millimetre zone, depending on how curved the cornea actually is. It makes numerous assumptions. It simply cannot measure irregular corneas, but it gave us a starting point with keratometry readings. I've got one of these, and if someone wants to buy one, it's better than a boat anchor, I promise. As we move along, we started talking about placido. Placido's been around for a long time, and placido was initially used to start looking at the surface and reflectance of the corneal surface. From there, we've developed arc-stack algorithms, which basically use an iterative process where we go from start at the central ring and we move our way outwards, and we look at a sequence of arcs that can then give us the topography of a surface. And what it's physically measuring is the slope from one point to the next. And from one point to the next, it can then create curvature map. It can then extrapolate that or mathematically turn that into height maps, which we can then design contact lenses from. Here in Melbourne, we've got the famously developed Medmont E300, which not far down the road from here is where it was developed, and they're still manufactured. They have 32 rings, and each image is given a score out of 100, which is based upon its centering, focus and movement. It's essentially just looking at a rangefinder. It doesn't actually tell you how accurate that map is, because for all sorts of reasons with placido, there's a lot of problems. If you've got deep set eyes, getting a very small cone in there can be very difficult, and even with the keratograph or all the long range placido topographies, you'll then get reflections or shadows. Narrow PDs can be a problem, dry eyes can be a problem. If you've got a large cornea, you're not going to simply measure it. And if you've got eye movement, it can be a big problem. Reflectance is the main one. And often you'll see poor reflectance of placido rings. If you've got poor reflectance of placido rings, you're simply not measuring anything, but you are diagnostically showing this person that they have a tear film that is breaking up and reflecting poorly. And my advice is, if you start seeing what you're seeing in that top right-hand corner, is don't fit them with a contact lens at that stage. Treat their dry eye first and get them back, and then do it again. Where placido topography falls down is when we start looking at corneas like this. Where we have highly irregular corneas with keratoconus, placido simply doesn't do it well enough. It simply cannot measure it. And we simply cannot get a cornea like this to measure with a placido topographer. So when we start seeing eyes like this, we need to start thinking about using elevation-based topography. We have two main sources of elevation-based topography, being the pentacam with the Schleimflug. That may or may not be a question on there. Now I've lost my train of thought. Topography, or in fact, even OCT in this day and age. So when we have images like this, we have the ability to look at elevation, and it's physically measuring elevation rather than measuring slope, which is what a placido topographer does. And from that, it can then convert that into curvature maps. But because it's measuring elevation in its purest form, these topographers are very, very, very accurate for fitting contact lenses. And if you're managing keratoconus and you really are monitoring ectasia, and certainly in the early stages of ectasia, really you must be using a tomographer, not a topographer, because in order to define ectasia progression, we really need to see change in at least the anterior cornea, posterior cornea, or corneal thickness. Because most of the early changes with keratoconus don't occur in the anterior cornea, they occur in the posterior cornea. The pentacam in particular has gone through a number of iterations. You'll see there's in fact 4 of them now. The standard, the HR with axial length measurement, and now in fact a new camera with in fact a Hartmann-Shack wavefront aberrometer, which can now measure wavefront aberrometry as well as all of these interesting corneal metrology. On top of that, these instruments can also measure the corneal scleral profile, which lends itself extremely well when we start thinking about fitting scleral lenses. we have the ability to get the sagittal height not just of the cornea but also of the sclera and conjunctival profile. And in fact the tangents, which if you do fit scleral lenses like I do, I fit an enormous amount of them, and you use this particular design, it's going to make your life a hell of a lot easier. OCT, pretty exciting. I somewhat think this is going to be the future, or maybe is the future, or maybe the future is here already. This instrument is now available. It's from Heidelberg. We can in fact get these amazing images like we see in the top left-hand corner. Can anyone see what's going on there? Throw me a few things at what's happening in that top left-hand picture. It's just phenomenal, isn't it? What do we have? Yeah, we've got a DMEC that's not sticking. Next. We've got an IOL in the bag. Yep. Anything else? There's also a bandaged contact lens in the front of that as well. You know, amazing imaging that we can capture with this, but we also now have the ability to use this for corneal metrology and in fact measure anterior posterior corneal topography as well as corneal thickness, anterior chamber depth. In fact, you can fit a line of the topography like we can in retina to pretty much anything in the anterior segment with these particular instruments, but you're not going to get much change out of 130K for something like that. I'm going to have a little sip of wine. So if you're going to do Ortho-K or you're going to have a corneal topographer, you need to evolve beyond K readings and pretty coloured pictures. And you need to understand that we have essentially four main maps: axial, tangential, refractive and elevation maps. Now axial is in fact the most commonly described map, probably the one that most people with topographers most commonly look at. And I'm going to tell you they're mathematically, quantitatively inaccurate and an utter waste of time to look at. Basically, they distort the true picture of the cornea. In keratoconus, they make the cones appear further from centre and more decentered, and they make them appear larger than they actually are. In corneal refractive procedures, Ortho-K, LASIK, etc., in fact, they make the treatment zones appear larger than they actually are, and they make them appear more decentered than they actually are. So stop looking at them. If you don't know what they actually are, let's describe what they are. We get a point on a cornea. We look at the tangent and then the normal to the surface, and we essentially measure the distance from that point to the instrument axis. That is now therefore the radius. We convert that to diopters. Does that actually mean anything as to where the light goes? We've all done optics, we understand optics. Does that mean anything? It doesn't actually mean anything at all. Tangential. Tangentials are in fact independent of any axis whatsoever. Whoops, pardon me. They are the radius of the circular arc that best approximate the curve at that point. So when we get our little bumps, they will show us the little bumps. It will show us these circles. If we were to draw the axis and do the normal, it would be that far. If I did it from here, it would be that far. It would really show us no difference when we look at an axial map. Tangential maps are the maps you should be looking at in keratoconus. They most accurately show you the position and the size of the treatment zone in corneal refractive procedures such as Ortho-K. The map you should be looking at instead of axial maps is in fact the refractive power map. Now, the difference with the refractive power map is it uses the power representation of the anterior tear film surface, not cornea, tear film surface, because it uses a refractive index of 1.3375. The refractive index of 1.3375 is the tear film, not the cornea. What's the refractive index of the cornea? 1.376, slightly higher, very good. Slightly higher. So it is in fact the tear film surface that it's looking at, and it uses optical ray tracing, and it uses Snell's law, which is in fact where the light actually goes, correct? So start looking at refractive power maps, not axial maps. The final one that's really important is elevation maps. or as I would prefer to call them, altimetry maps. Often we talk about topography as like mountain ranges, high spots, low spots, and all those sorts of things. In fact, our tangential maps are nothing like that. They're actually the complete opposite of that if you think about them as an altimetry. Elevation maps really are altimetry, and they're described in Cartesian coordinates, x, y, and z. And what you're looking at in this map, the coloured picture, is showing you the z coordinates. It is in fact the most direct measure of corneal shape, and it uses a difference from a reference surface. So now that we understand corneal shape better, let's start thinking about an Ortho-K lens and where it all started from. And an Ortho-K lens all started from, in 1962, the first meeting and description of this by George Jessen in Chicago. And he essentially described where by fitting conventional rigid gas permeable lenses, he was in fact able to change people's vision and change the curvature of their corneas by fitting them either flatter, which would correct myopia, and low levels of myopia, as well as steeper. And in fact, he actually described that it was easier to do people and steepen corneas than it was to flatten them, which you can understand when he had a lens that fitted like that, right? Because what's that going to do? It's going to rock around. We know these lenses in the past were very small. They're going to decenter terribly. Whereas a nice little small rigid lens, that's steeper, it's going to sit where it should do, and it's certainly going to steepen the cornea. Often credited as one of the early pioneers of what is modern day Ortho-K is Nick Stone of Contex. And he was in fact the first person who's now patented in 1990 a three-curve design, where if we look at our profile that we have here, we have a flatter back optic followed by a steeper reverse curve, which was coined, followed by then a flatter edge lift. And this is what was the original sort of modern day Ortho-K lens. We then can thank John Mountford, the recently retired John Mountford, a good friend of mine and someone I look up to an enormous amount. He wrote the first textbook. He's often credited as the grandfather or father of Ortho-K. And what he did with that design was essentially same thing, flatter back optic, steeper curve, and then he put a tangent. And a tangent works like that. Creates what looks like a pretty good lens, right? Then came along Thomas R. Ream, an American gentleman who is the president of Dream Lens, a lens that's used all around the world. It's credited as being the first four-curve design. So where he then evolved the design of Ortho-K lenses was again flatter curve, same thing, reverse curve, but instead this time he fitted a peripheral curve that aligned to the peripheral cornea, followed by some edge lift. And essentially, pretty much every Ortho-K design out there is essentially some iteration or variation of that. Okay, pretty much every design. The only thing people do differently between all the different brands is essentially come up with nomenclature, systems, trial sets, but they're all essentially working on a similar concept. Over time, people continue to evolve these things. This is my friend Jaime. He's a Spanish gentleman. He's obviously spent a lot of time looking at the Pyrenees Mountains and all the different topography of the Pyrenees Mountain to come up with a topography profile that looks like such, and he's in fact got a double reverse curve design and a double reservoir design, as he calls it, which it's a continual elevation of making things sometimes more complicated, which I can promise you I've done over the years of designing lenses, and now I'm moving to a process of life must be simpler than this. My particular go at Ortho-K lenses was the Forge lens, which was 5, 6, 7 years ago, something like that. And the Forge design is essentially a 5-curve design, and the nomenclature that we came up with for this design was we have our back optic zone radius, which again in a myopic lens is fitted flatter. our Z zone, because again we talk about the X meridian, the Y meridian, and now the Z meridian. And the reverse curve on all Ortho K lenses simply controls how deep or how shallow a lens is and controls the apical clearance. We then have an alignment curve, which as the name suggests, should align to the cornea, followed by every rigid lens should have edge lift. Now, initially we had a lot of secret sauce in this design, as lots of people like to put secret sauce in their designs. Paul Rose was probably the originator of secret sauce when it comes to Rose K and trying to make life simpler for people and having systems. But as we were dealing with a topography-based lens design in Ortho K, what we've essentially done over time is give you all the secret sauce. So it started off as simply a design where, yes, you could specify back optic zone, the Z zone, alignment curve, diameter. But over time, we've actually given you the ability to control everything else. So the software can do it all for you, but if you're someone who likes fiddling, then you've got the ability to do lots of other lenses and lots of other things with them. So when I think about fitting an Ortho K lens, what's the process that I go through? 4 steps. 4 steps when I'm checking what the software does for me. And with the particular system that I'm talking about, which is here, is this really is now the age of AI. Okay? And some of us might be frightened about what AI is going to do for us. Is it going to take our jobs? Are we going to have any patients to see? Well, the reality is AI and things like this make us better practitioners. And there is only a certain amount that this can do with the information that we feed it. But then, as highly trained optometrists, ophthalmologists, eye care practitioners, we have the ability to take what this does for us and then feed it more information. And that's essentially what we're doing, is I'm making the checks on what did Sadie, actually I say Sadie, because Jake here convinced me to get a robot vacuum. You know, the Roomba things? He reckons it cleans his house better than his lovely wife. No, I shouldn't say that. Cleans it better than him. And he convinced me that we had to get one, and I've got one as well, and I call it Sadie. And are we checking what it does? So the first thing that we need to check with any contact lens is the diameter. So we want to measure the diameter on your topographer. All the systems pretty much enable you to do this, where you want to measure it as horizontally as possible. And in my opinion, when we look at these infrared images, we have this sort of funny transition from nearly white to nearly dark. I like to go from sort of dark to dark because it fits within the boundaries of the cornea. And when we start talking about the way in which our artificial intelligence, iSpace, is actually going to calculate this for us, it's going to work somewhere between 93 and 97% of the HVID, depending on a series of factors. However, if you get poor centration, the simplest way of fixing it is to make the diameter as large as it possibly can be, because the larger a lens, the better it'll center. And you can make lenses up to 100% of the HVID should your system allow it, because not all do. However, it's very important that a lens on eye never ever overlaps the limbus. Step number 2 is we start looking at the back optic zone radius. Now, the back optic zone radius on an Ortho K lens, unlike other RGPs we fit, has absolutely nothing to do with the fitting. Okay? It's not like a trial set where we get our K readings, flat K, mean K, whatever your system tells you, and you go grab that lens. In Ortho K lenses, the back optic zone radius is purely responsible for the amount of refractive change. Flatter, this might be a question, flatter back optic zone radiuses will in fact flatten the cornea more and give you more myopia correction. And Jessen, all the way back in the 70s, gave us a formula where the back optic zone radius equals the SIM-Ks plus the spectacle refraction plus some form of compression factor. If you use Dream Lens uses a compression factor of plus 0.75. If you use CRT, it uses a compression factor of plus 0.50. If you use GOV, it uses a compression factor of 125. If you use the GOV high myopia design, it uses 175. However, that's essentially how it's created. But someone a hell of a lot smarter than me, Pauline Cho and John Mountford, and I'm not even sure who B. Chan is, but that's someone else on there who was the lead author in this. In fact, they looked at 123 consecutive Ortho-K patients, and they came up with their own algorithm, which is a little bit more accurate, where in fact they use that, and guess what? That's what we use. Now, alignment curve. Alignment curve, as the name suggests, should align to the area of the cornea it sits on, which is the peripheral cornea. Now, I like to think about this like a foot, okay? This is our footing where a lens sits. We have our toe, which is on the outer part, our toe, which sits down, and then we have our heel, which is the inner part. We want it to land as evenly as possible. If the heel is down, the lens is flat. If the toe is down, the alignment curve is steep. Okay? It's as simple as making this lens fit with alignment. When we do that, we get excellent centration, we get excellent comfort, we get, in fact, fantastic sealing of the forces that are created under an Ortho-K lens, and we get a better result. The final check is the Z zone, because the reality is if you adjusted any one of those previous parameters, the sagittal depth of the overall lens will change. So your very last step is you need to control what is that central tear film thickness, which in the software here is denoted by that number. That is the last one you need to adjust. And as I described before, lenses with insufficient central clearance are the ones that will decenter, but most importantly, they're also the ones that will cause the most common adverse event in orthokeratology lens wear, which is central staining. Something that I simply never want to see. Why? Because this puts my patients at risk of microbial keratitis. We create corneal insult, we give an opening to opportunistic bacteria to get into the cornea, we run the risk of adverse events. Now, I produced this slide to show you the reason why you've been looking at this thing with the blue and had no idea what it meant the whole time. Because you certainly don't see blue when you put the lenses on eye. Is because if you look at these, certainly the first four at the top, and potentially even this one, if you took the blue out of that picture and you put those lenses on eye, I'm not sure I could tell which one was which. Because the reality is if you fit via trial fitting, as I certainly did when I started doing Ortho-K, is you simply cannot differentiate and your eye cannot see better to a resolution than about 20 to 25 microns because fluorescein doesn't become visible until about 20 microns. So if I was to fit this lens that's up here, in fact, the entirety of that lens corneal bearing is on the central cornea. And you can imagine if I fitted this lens, what I'm going to end up with. Whereas if I put the bearing and the lens corneal bearing, it has to sit somewhere, it has to touch the cornea somewhere, right? I want it to be in the periphery and I want to leave the central cornea alone so it can do its molding and do it safely. We're going to talk very quickly about a few of the different advanced parameters, which back optic zone diameter. Now you might say, why do I need to change the back optic zone diameter? And not many designs allow you to do this, but it is actually really important because the back optic zone diameter, if we want to reduce the effect of spherical aberration with someone with a large pupil, we want to make the optic zone as large as possible, which makes the treatment zone and the area where you flatten the cornea larger. Whereas, potentially, if you wanted to create more multifocal effect in a presbyope, you would make it smaller. If you look at something like the Biofinity multifocal design, that lens only has like a 3 millimeter central zone. It's very, very small. Arguably for myopia control, I put a big question mark next to that up there, that maybe you want to make them smaller, but I disagree with that assertion. And I'll argue it later. The alignment curve eccentricity. Why would we want to adjust this? Well, not all corneas flatten into the periphery at the same rate. Some designs out there, and most of them, in fact, with spherical curves, will use lower eccentricity. The problem is with these early designs is this is what you got. And when you do that, you start seeing impingement and you start seeing moulding of the epithelium. You'll actually see rings in it, a bit like when you see patients who have had smile surgery. Has anyone seen patients with smile surgery? You know how you put fluorescent in and you can actually physically see the ring where the lenticule has been taken out? Well, you'll see the same thing if you fit that. We want to see them that they fit a really aligned. If you get this really curved centre, it means that the eccentricity of the lens is a hell of a lot higher than that of the peripheral cornea. So you've got the ability to adjust it should you need to. You don't often need to, but you've got the ability to do it if you need. The final thing being edge lift. Edge lift, inherently, most Ortho-K designs out there, most of the problems that we've seen with them is they have insufficient edge lift. And in particular, when you start fitting very large lenses, you need a lot more edge lift than you think in order to clear the limbus or the peripheral cornea that approaches the limbus. And I like to aim for anywhere from 70 to 100 horizontally, and you always need more vertically. Why do we need more vertically, guys? Moving. Which way are lenses supposed to move? Up and down, not left and right. Okay, so that's what promotes lens movement and tear exchange. What about when we start counting the different meridional shapes? Here's the main three that you're going to see, which is a rotationally symmetric, or some people refer to as a spherical cornea, which it isn't, a toric eye, where we have two principal meridians of a lens, and in fact an asymmetrical cornea which might have some form of resemblance of periodicity but is essentially irregular. So let's talk about the simple one, torics. Who's fitting toric Ortho-K lenses? So a lot of spherical lenses but not a lot of toric Ortho-K lenses. Well, the reality is they're really easy, and in fact they probably work better than the spherical ones because they centre beautifully. So if we had an eye like this eye has 3.5 diopters of astigmatism. Would you tackle this with Ortho-K? Is this a contraindication to Ortho-K, or is this someone you can fit? Who'd walk away? Everyone's going to fit it, are they? All right. It's always good when you ask for a negative. Now, if we were to fit a rotationally symmetric design and we were trial fitting from a set of rotationally symmetric lenses, good luck. Have fun, you're going to cause patient a lot of discomfort. They're definitely not going to want to pay the bill when they walk out the end. And you would end up seeing a lens that would rock and move, and if you were lucky enough to actually get it into the centre, you're going to see something like this, where along our horizontal meridian we're going to have a beautiful fitting Ortho-K profile. But in our vertical meridian, we've got a hell of a lot of pulling top and bottom, and this lens is going to be extremely loose. It's going to rock and float up and down, probably fall out of the eye. It's never going to fit. But with topography-based lens design, we have the ability now, in fact, to specify the lens in two directions, both horizontally and vertically. By two lines, we don't do anything more complicated other than treat it as if it is two lenses. We treat it as if it's two lenses, okay? Let's talk for another day. We'll leave that one. Ultimately, we end up with something that'll do like this, where we can, in fact, not only flatten and centre these lenses superbly, but we have the ability refractively, in fact, to correct astigmatism. What else can we do? What else can we do? Well, pretty much any prescription you can think of, I've tried to do it with Ortho-K and successfully sold it to my patients, is that things like myopic astigmatism, someone who's plano with a 350 sil. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means in the horizontal meridian, plano. It's an alignment fit. Whereas in the vertical meridian, guess what? I need to correct 3.5 diopters of myopia. I can in fact treat it as two separate lenses, and two separate lenses with Ortho-K. What about mixed astigmatism? Well, we can do exactly the same thing. With mixed astigmatism, I now need plus 125 at 180. And what do I need at 90? Minus 225. Right? So we need a plus correction in one direction and a minus correction in the other. And I promise you it works. I promise you can do this. And especially with these sometimes mixed astigmatism patients who are often walking around unaided with somewhat crappy vision, but they can sort of see 675, 610 just. Improving their unaided vision by simply wearing a lens at night will make you a hero. High myopia. Who's tackling high myopia? You're crazy. You're crazy. I'm not a big fan of high myopia, although I somehow get asked to lecture on it somewhat regularly. And I blame my previous optometrist who worked with me, Alex Petty, for most of this. He was a high myopia himself. He's 2 weeks into starting work with me about 5 years ago. He had a retinal detachment. It was in fact his third retinal detachment before the age of 30. So he was somewhat passionate about myopia and high myopia. So he decided every high myopic kid needed Ortho K, which I didn't necessarily think was the best idea. Then after 2 years he left me and went back to New Zealand and left me with all these kids in Ortho K with high myopia wearing these lenses. And I discovered something very quickly. Is if you've tried to fit these patients, or if you've seen anyone who's attempted and they've wandered into your practice, you've probably seen a hell of a lot of central staining. Who's seen that, right? Now, that's what I saw when Alex left me. So one of the things that I discovered after many hundreds and thousands of dollars of lenses later is that with high myopia you need to do this. Now, who thinks that looks like an Ortho K or a good Ortho K fit? If you put that lens on eye, you probably take it out, you go grab the next trial lens if you were trial fitting, right? Well, I certainly would have. That's what I was taught. But I was also taught, as part of troubleshooting, should you see central staining, how do you fix it? You increase the depth of the lens and increase the corneal clearance. Now, one of the interesting things that I observe, and which I'm always testing and somewhat simply amazed, even though I've probably done this 10, 20, 30,000 times, is design a lens purely from the topography, simulate it, which tells me it should look like that, and then when I deliver it, it should look the same. And sure enough, it does. Now, one of the things, if you've ever fitted our lenses, is they've all got a unique serial code. Now, I promise you I'm not tricking. 5 minutes later, it looks like that. You see the engraving? CNDZ. CNDZ on the same eye now looks like that. Well, what does it do is it settles into the epithelium. Who's ever taken out a foreign body? How squishy is the epithelium? It's gelatinous, right? There's a hell of a lot of water in there, right? With these lenses, and it's certainly a very big lens, this is an 11.4 millimeter lens, is they settle, okay? And they settle and mold. Surprise, surprise, an Ortho K lens molds and reshapes the cornea, is they settle into the cornea and the central clearance reduces over time. And sure enough, you look at it another 10 minutes later and then it starts looking like that. Now, this is the same lens on the same eye, right? This is within sort of 20 minutes. This is what happens when you fit lenses this way, okay, is they settle a hell of a lot. Now, I've used the simulation on the right to show you what's happening, because in fact with iSpace you can in fact control that and change simulations and do all sorts of fancy things if you know how to click all the buttons, which is one of the designers of this, you'd think I'd know how to, but you'd be surprised. So we can drop this lens down, and in fact this is what happens. So often when you start approaching high myopia, I've had instances where I've needed to fit these with 50 microns of central clearance. Now that might seem crazy, and I think it is, and sometimes it's that far until I stop seeing central staining, but you can do this. Now this is a tangential map. Now remember I told you tangential maps show you shape, and they're the most accurate Look how great that centration is. Now no one can see the scale, that's minus 14.5 diopters. That's dark blue. Minus 14.5 diopters of peripheral flattening. That's 14.5 diopters in red, 14.5 diopters of steepening. And that number right there is 9.6 diopters. And when we start looking at that refractively, this is a patient who is minus 7 with a 250 SIL. In fact, I've corrected the SIL and I've in fact corrected all of the myopia. You can do it, but you need to fit these lenses with a lot more central clearance than you've ever been taught before. So where to from here with Ortho-K? What's the future? What's coming? How could we make it better? These are all the questions that I started asking myself about 3 years ago. How could we improve on this traditional 4 or sometimes 5 curve design, which it is? Well, why is it that globally only 5% of optometrists are still fitting Ortho-K? Maybe because it's perceived as difficult, expensive, time-consuming, barrier to entries. Maybe because they don't get the best centration, as we talked about for all sorts of reasons before. Maybe because the most common adverse event is corneal staining. Could we give wider treatment zones to improve the quality of vision? And what about a system that, rather than being parameter-based and all sorts of weird and wonderful nomenclatures that you've got to learn, what if we made it more clinical-based? Because all optometrists understand central staining. We all understand a lens needs more edge lift or less edge lift, but we don't necessarily talk about the parameters that way. And maybe comfort. Maybe we're concerned that rigid lenses, our patients are going to find them uncomfortable. What if we could make them more comfortable? So we sort of went on a little bit of thinking, and rather than continuing to make lenses more complicated, we sought out to make this less complicated. So rather than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 curves, what if we just went 1, 2? 2 curves. Could we make Ortho-K so unbelievably simple that all we have to do is enter in the target power, the diameter, what clearance I want, and what edge lift I want? Because ultimately, clinically, that's all we want to create. And that's what we've done. What about hyperopic Ortho-K? Now, who's fitting hyperopic Ortho-K here? If you're not, you should seriously consider it. Fitting emmetropic presbyopes is money for jam. It's dead easy. It's absolutely dead easy. You get the 55-year-old who's never had to have glasses their entire lives, and now they have to wear reading glasses or put glasses on any time they see anything. And the beauty with hyperopic Ortho-K is it creates a center-near distance periphery multifocal, which means if you give them that +2 that they need, the near eye, rather than being 660, is still better than 612. It's sort of 610, 675. So they still have binocularity. They still have stereopsis that they've enjoyed their entire lives, but now they can read. And before my practice got so involved in myopia control, is probably 50-50. The first maybe 500 Ortho-K patients I fitted, 250 of them wore hyperopic Ortho-K. And they're the ones who tell everyone. So with hyperopic Ortho-K, present day designs out there use 7 curves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I don't know how I got to that, but anyway, 7 curves. Now, 7 curves. Well, how do we make it simpler? I promise you that is 1, 2 curves. You can now do something as complicated as that with 2 curves. So my goal with everything when it comes to now contact lens fitting, initially it was how complicated could I make this? Now it's how easy and simplified we can make this. What if we look at what other people are doing and what's been done in the past, how do we make it simpler? And that's essentially been my little project for a while. And this is the sort of result that you get from hyperopic Ortho-K. Again, baseline map, post map, difference map. If you're assessing Ortho-K, get really good at looking at these. And in particular, you don't necessarily worry about that. It's this map that you really want to look at. And in this instance, as you can see, we've got dark red in the middle, so that's more plus correction. We've got the orange and yellows and green colours to the periphery. That is a centre near distance periphery aspheric multifocal, the same as the one that our friends at Alcon make with the Air Optics multifocal. The Total Daly's 1, this is a centre near aspheric multifocal. Thanks very much, guys. Cheers.
Please join me with me in thanking Lachlan for a wonderful talk. It was very engaging and very passionate, and we're very grateful to have you here.
Thanks. Thank you. Oh, cheers. Thank you.